My father always had a way of making his voice carry further than the walls of our home. It wasn't just the volume. It was the certainty behind every word, the kind of certainty that left no room for debate. He used that voice to carve me into something I never asked to be, something he could ridicule and control. "You're the rotten egg of this family," he would say, his lips curling into a half-smile that never reached his eyes. He said it in front of relatives, in front of my siblings, even in front of strangers. And the worst part was the way people laughed, as if the humiliation of his own son was just another one of his entertaining party tricks. From as far back as I can remember, I was the one set apart. My older brother, Daniel, was the pride of the family. The golden boy who followed in Dad's footsteps, studying law and becoming the kind of polished man who could shake hands, smile, and win people over without trying. My younger sister, Melissa, was the daughter every parent wanted. Beautiful, ambitious, and adored, she was constantly showered with compliments and gifts. And then there was me, the middle child, the one Dad dismissed with a wave of his hand, reminding me at every opportunity that I was different, that I would never live up to the name our family carried. At first, I thought it was a challenge. As a boy, I told myself that if I worked harder, if I studied longer, if I achieved something undeniable, he would have to see me differently. I stayed up late with my textbooks, pushing myself until exhaustion blurred the words. I took jobs that drained me physically just so I could pay for things without asking him for a dime. I bent myself into every shape I thought would make him proud. But no matter what I did, his verdict never changed. If I came home with good grades, he compared them unfavorably to Daniel's. If I saved money for something I wanted, he mocked the choice. If I said nothing at all, he filled the silence with his own cruel narrative. "You'll never be like them," he said one night after Melissa announced a promotion. "You'll always fall short. That's just who you are. Every family has a rotten egg, and you're mine." Those words became a cage. At first, I rattled the bars, desperate to break free. I thought if I screamed loud enough, if I worked hard enough, he would unlock the door. But the older I got, the more I realized that cage wasn't meant to open. He liked me trapped inside it. It gave him someone to point to, someone to compare the others against. My brother's successes seemed brighter because they were measured against my supposed failures. My sister's achievements felt larger because he painted me as so small. It took me years to understand. The rotten egg role wasn't a reflection of me. It was a role he needed me to play so his story about our family could work. That realization didn't free me immediately. In fact, it sank into me like poison. Because once you've been told long enough that you're worthless, part of you starts to believe it. But belief has strange ways of transforming. At some point, I stopped wishing he would see me differently. I stopped begging for scraps of approval. And I decided that if he wanted me to be rotten, then rotten I would be. Not the quiet, forgotten kind he could dismiss with a laugh, but the kind that spreads, the kind that makes everyone else cover their noses and realize something has gone bad. The night I made that decision is burned into my memory. My father had invited some of his business partners over. The house was polished from top to bottom, the table set with the finest silverware, the chandelier casting a golden glow over everything. Daniel and Melissa sat on either side of him, their posture perfect, their smiles rehearsed. I was there because, in his mind, the show wasn't complete without me, the prop he could humiliate for a laugh. After the main course, as glasses clinked and conversation flowed, he leaned back in his chair and gestured toward us. "These are my children," he said proudly. He pointed at Daniel. "This one's a lawyer, sharp as a blade, destined for greatness." He motioned toward Melissa. "This one's my shining star, climbing higher every day." Then his hand drifted lazily toward me, his smirk widening. "And this one, well, every family has a rotten egg, gentlemen. He's mine. Don't expect much from him." Laughter rippled around the table. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Melissa glanced at me quickly before looking down at her plate. "And me?" I smiled faintly, pretending the words bounced off. But inside, something snapped. The laughter was the last straw. That night, lying awake in the dark, I replayed it over and over, and by morning, I knew. If I was going to be the rotten egg, then I'd be the one that cracked his empire from the inside. I didn't act right away. I knew better than to rush into anything fueled only by anger. My father had spent decades building his image. He wasn't careless, and he wasn't stupid. For every cruel word he threw at me, he had a dozen charming ones for his friends, his business associates, and even the neighbors who thought he was the model of discipline. If I made one wrong move, I'd look like exactly what he painted me to be, a bitter, envious failure. So I stayed quiet. I let him think I had given up. Silence became my weapon. When he mocked me, I nodded. When he compared me to Daniel and Melissa, I smiled faintly. I stopped protesting, stopped trying to explain myself, stopped defending anything I did. And in that quiet, I became invisible to him. Before we continue, be part of our growing family by hitting that subscribe button. And here's something fun. Share your name and tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments. We might feature you with a shout out in our next video, because your support truly means the world to us. Now, let's proceed. Invisible enough to move without being noticed. It started with small observations. I paid attention when his phone rang late at night, and he stepped out onto the porch to answer. I noticed when he left for business trips, but returned smelling of expensive perfume. I watched when envelopes of cash passed between his hands and men I had never seen before. He thought I wasn't paying attention. He thought I was too beaten down to notice. But I saw it all. Over time, I began collecting proof. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, only that I needed something more solid than suspicion. I waited until he left his study unattended, and I went in. My hands trembled the first time, but fear faded quickly as I opened drawers and flipped through files. That's when I found it. Accounts he hadn't told my mother about, money transferred under names that weren't his, investments hidden in companies I'd never heard of. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered. Property deeds in other states. Receipts for jewelry I'd never seen him give to my mother. Bank statements that told a story completely different from the one he shared at the dinner table. It was like peeling back layers of polished paint only to find rot beneath the surface. And the mistress, her existence confirmed what I'd suspected. Phone records, photos tucked into folders, even messages on an old phone he thought no one used anymore. She lived comfortably in a city 2 hours away, her rent and expenses covered by my father's secret accounts. The man who loved to remind me of how useless I was had built an entire second life out of lies. I didn't rush to expose him. I was patient. Every piece of evidence went into a folder I kept hidden. Every receipt, every recording, every document was copied and stored. By the time I was done, I had enough to not only destroy his reputation, but dismantle the empire he held together with charm and intimidation. My siblings noticed nothing. Daniel was too busy polishing his career, too eager to bask in the approval Dad gave him for every minor victory. Melissa was too wrapped up in her promotions and shopping sprees, too proud to question the hand that fed her praise. They thought the world Dad built for them was solid. They didn't see the cracks spreading under their feet. But I did. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't powerless. The first blow I struck was quiet. I mailed a set of documents anonymously to one of his investors, a man known for being ruthless when it came to dishonesty. Weeks later, I heard whispers at the table about meetings that hadn't gone well, about questions being raised. My father dismissed them with bravado, but I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. Then came the tax authorities. I sent them files, copies of accounts he had buried so deep he thought no one would find them. More questions, more whispers, more tension in the air at home. My siblings were confused by the change in his mood. They thought maybe it was stress, maybe age catching up to him. They didn't realize the storm building outside was one I had summoned. I still remember the first time my father's mask slipped. He was on the phone in his study, his voice sharp, his tone defensive. "What do you mean, discrepancies? Those numbers are solid. I don't know what you're talking about." When he hung up, he sat there in silence for a long time, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. I watched from the hallway, my heart pounding, knowing that the cracks were widening. And yet, I wasn't finished. The final step was making sure Daniel and Melissa saw him clearly. They had spent their entire lives believing in his version of reality, blinded by the praise he showered on them. If I simply told them the truth, they wouldn't believe me. They'd accuse me of jealousy, of bitterness. So, I gave them proof they couldn't ignore. I left envelopes for each of them, documents, photos, copies of transfers. Everything neatly organized so they could follow the trail themselves. The reactions came quickly. Daniel stormed into my room, his face red with anger. What is this? Lies. You're trying to tear this family apart. Melissa was quieter, but her hands shook as she held the papers. Why would you do this? Why would you go after Dad like this? I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, read them carefully. Decide for yourselves who's really been tearing this family apart. They didn't speak to me for days after that, but I could see the doubt creeping into their eyes when they looked at him. The certainty they once had was gone, and that was all I needed. By the time the storm truly hit, there was no turning back. My father's investors pulled away. The tax authorities launched their inquiries. His mistress, seeing the cracks, filed her own claims. His empire, the one he had built over decades, began to crumble piece by piece. And all the while, I stayed quiet, watching from the sidelines as the man who called me the rotten egg discovered what real rot looked like. The night everything finally broke was a dinner that was supposed to look like all the others. The table was set, the silver polished, the wine bottles arranged neatly by vintage. My mother, who had long learned to play the quiet role of peacekeeper, moved around the dining room with practiced calm. Daniel and Melissa came dressed sharply, their smiles ready for the usual round of praise. My father took his seat at the head, shoulders straight, eyes burning with the pride he always reserved for himself more than for any of us. But something was different. His voice didn't carry the same thunder. His shoulders weren't quite as squared. He spoke, but the confidence cracked at the edges. He praised Daniel, as usual. He admired Melissa's new car. Then he looked at me, opened his mouth to deliver the line he had rehearsed for decades, and stopped. For the first time, the words didn't come. His smirk faltered. His fingers twitched against the tablecloth. The silence stretched longer than it ever had before. You've been busy, haven't you? He finally said, his voice low, sharp. The others looked confused. My mother froze. Daniel frowned. Melissa tilted her head slightly. I leaned forward, calm. Busy? Maybe. Or maybe I just got tired of being the rotten egg. Melissa gasped. Daniel shook his head. What is this? He asked. But my father's eyes were locked on me, fury and fear swirling together. You think you've won something? He said. You think tearing this family apart makes you strong? No, I said evenly. I didn't tear it apart. You did. All I did was peel back the shell you painted over the cracks. His hand slammed against the table, the silverware rattling. Lies. Do you think I don't know it was you? The documents, the calls, He stopped abruptly, realizing too late that he was confessing in front of his golden children. Daniel turned to him, his face pale. What documents? Melissa's eyes darted between us. What calls? The silence was heavier than any insult he had ever thrown at me. For once, it wasn't me being accused. It was him. And he couldn't explain it away. The shouting started soon after. Daniel demanded answers. Melissa cried. My mother begged for calm. But my father could no longer control the narrative. Every attempt to deny was countered by evidence. Every claim of innocence fell apart under the weight of truth. And me? I stayed quiet, letting the storm consume him. By the end of the night, the empire he built wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. His investors had already started pulling away. The tax authorities had already filed inquiries. The mistress he thought he controlled had already taken steps to protect herself. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and for the first time, I saw the man who had always seemed untouchable look small. You did this, he whispered, almost to himself, his eyes still locked on me. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply said, you call me the rotten egg. You made me this. If you don't like what I became, you should have thought twice before planting the seed. He had no answer. None at all. The days after that dinner felt like watching a storm sweep through a city. Walls that once looked unshakable cracked in plain sight. People who once bowed to my father's name began avoiding his calls. Business partners who once praised his discipline now whispered about his deception. The empire he had built for decades began to topple. Not because I shouted, not because I demanded revenge, but because truth has a way of cutting deeper than any blade when it's timed right. At home, The atmosphere turned heavy. My father, who once walked with a chest full of arrogance, now moved slower, his eyes darting nervously whenever the phone rang. He still tried to bark orders at my mother, at Daniel, at Melissa, but the sharpness of his voice had dulled. His words no longer carried the same weight, because everyone at the table had seen what lay beneath his polished mask. Daniel was the first to confront him. "Is it true?" he asked one night, his tone sharp, his face pale. He held some of the papers I'd slipped into his room, documents my father couldn't deny. The accounts? The transfers? The other house? My father slammed his fist on the table. "Don't you question me. After everything I've given you, this is how you talk to me. You gave me nothing," Daniel snapped, surprising everyone. "You gave me your name, and now I find out it's worth less than dirt." Melissa cried quietly, her hands trembling as she whispered, "How could you do this to Mom? To us?" My mother sat in silence. For years, she had played the role of peacekeeper, smoothing edges, patching wounds, pretending not to notice. But now, the weight of it all sat heavy on her face. She looked at him not with anger, but with something worse, disappointment so deep it left him no defense. He turned to me, his eyes bloodshot. "You did this," he said, his voice cracking. I leaned back in my chair, calm. "No, you did this. I just stopped covering for you." His shoulders slumped. For a moment, I thought he might argue, might roar back to life and remind us of the man he once was. But he didn't. He stayed there, silent, broken, and I realized something I never thought I'd see. He was afraid of me. The weeks that followed stripped him bare. The authorities froze his accounts. His mistress drained what little leverage he thought he had. His business collapsed under lawsuits and investigations. The friends who once toasted him at dinners now crossed the street to avoid him. Daniel grew bitter, blaming me for destroying everything, though I noticed how quickly he stopped mentioning Dad at work. Melissa pulled away, ashamed to be associated with his name. My mother aged years and months, carrying the shame of a marriage built on lies. And me? I felt none of the guilt they tried to pin on me. For years, I had been the scapegoat, the rotten egg, the one he mocked to make himself look bigger. But when the truth came out, it wasn't me who rotted, it was him. All I had done was peel back the shell and let everyone see. One evening, he sat across from me at the same dining table where it all began. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Why?" he asked. I looked at him steadily. "Because you told me who I was, over and over again. And I finally believed you. You wanted me to be the rotten egg. I became one. Not for myself, but for you." He had no response. His eyes dropped, his shoulders slumped. And in that moment, I realized the most painful truth of all. He wasn't the giant I had fought against my whole life. He was just a man, weak and flawed, who had spent so long pretending to be strong that he couldn't survive when the mask broke. I stood, pushing back my chair. "You were right about one thing," I said. "I was never like Daniel or Melissa. I was never meant to be." While they followed blindly, I watched. While they chased your approval, I learned what you really were. And when the time came, I was the only one strong enough to end it. And with that, I walked away, not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Because in the end, the rotten egg didn't ruin me. It ruined him. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us.